This next lesson that we're going to be talking about today is part 2 of context clues. Remember in the last lesson we discussed context clues, but before even we discussed context clues, we talked about the reading process. We had a few key terms that we went over in the reading process because they are important to help us get to context clues and understanding what we're reading. The first thing that we talked about was comprehension, and remember we said comprehension was understanding what you have read. We also talked about being an active reader, and being an active reader doesn't mean I read a lot, I read every day. It doesn't mean that. Remember, being an active reader is getting actively involved in what you're reading. It doesn't mean that you take your finger and you follow across the page and you read, you know, you kind of go along with the lines, because how many of you have done that before, and after completing the whether it was a paragraph or reading a chapter, you still didn't understand what you had read. So when you become an active reader, you get actively involved, and the way you get actively involved is you ask questions, you look for answers, and you try to figure out what the author wants you to know. So that's what it means to be an active reader. We also talked about prior knowledge. When an author writes, they want us to have some background knowledge of what they are writing, and when we have prior knowledge, it's easier for us to understand what the author has written and what they want us to know. And the other term that I introduced to you was vocabulary, which is one of those words we've heard all of these words. I don't think they're going to be new to any of you, but vocabulary, all the words that we use and understand. And vocabulary is a very, very big part of reading, because if you don't understand the vocabulary, it can slow down the reading process and your comprehension. So vocabulary has to be included in the reading process to help you with your comprehension. And back to our original topic for this lesson was context clues, and that's one of the ways that we're going to learn what vocabulary is, or learn the unfamiliar vocabulary words that we come across when we're reading. We're going to use context clues to help us figure out what the meaning of a word is. And we said in the last segment that we did that context clues, it's when you take an unfamiliar word and you surround it with words that you are familiar with to help you understand the meaning. And basically the way you do that is you put it in a sentence. You put it in a sentence and you understand the meaning by looking at the clues surrounding that word, okay? Because there are many times I see a word and I can't really figure out the meaning of it. It may be familiar to me, it may be unfamiliar, but when I place it in a sentence and use those context clues, and then the light comes on, oh, that's the meaning of the word, okay? So we're going to continue on with context clues, and I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint, and we're going to discuss some of the other context clues that are going to help us figure out the meaning of these unfamiliar words. So context clues part 2 is what we're going to be learning. And again, I did include the definition of context clues again. We said we can use the SAGE approach to help us remember the 4 types of context clues that we have learned in these 2 lessons. We have 4 context clues. We discussed synonyms and antonyms in the last lesson. We said synonyms are words that have the same or similar meaning as another word, and antonyms have the opposite meaning of another word. And those, by learning those 2 things, that will help us figure out the meaning of the unfamiliar word. The 2 that we're going to discuss in this lesson will be general sense of the passage, and you'll hear me say just general sense. And then we're also going to talk about how examples can be used as context clues to help us figure out the meaning of words. Okay? So general context. General context can be several different things. Sometimes they will give us a definition. Sometimes they will give us a description. Sometimes they will just have us rely on logic and reasoning skills. And that's basically what general context is. And really what I call this particular one, I call general context common sense. Because they give us enough clues, whether it be the definition, whether it's a description, or if they want us to rely on logic and reasoning, which is common sense to me. We just read the sentence and we understand what it means. And again, it goes back to prior knowledge. If we understand that we have some prior knowledge on that particular subject, whether it's a sentence, paragraph, essay, then that's going to help us figure out the meaning of a word. Here's an example. To ensure safety, written and road tests should be mandatory for everyone who seeks a driver's license for the first time. No exceptions should be allowed. So what are they telling us? It's mandatory. And again, some of these words you might be familiar with, but you don't have to look for a synonym. You don't have to look for an anonym. You just read this sentence and you understand what it means. For one reason you understand it is because you have prior knowledge on what it takes to get your driver's license. Okay? So when it says it's mandatory for everyone who seeks a driver's license, we know it's required. We have to have it. Okay? So that's why I call this one common sense. Common sense and general sense are the same thing. This is the context clue. Okay? And again, we rely on prior knowledge and we just read through it. If you don't have to ask, where's my synonym? Where's my anonym? Did they give me examples? You just say, I read it and I understood what it meant. And then that's why it's common sense. Okay? So that's our common sense one. Here's another example of the common sense or general sense. Jamie speculated about how much weight he wanted to gain during the 3-month bodybuilding program he was beginning for the first time. So we're trying to find, as you can see, the highlighted thing would be speculated. What does speculated mean? In most cases, you'll have choices, okay? So we have 4 choices. Did he, Jamie knew about how much he would gain, Jamie wondered, Jamie worried, or he celebrated, okay? Now, just like in math class you're able to check your work, right? We can do the very same thing in English, okay? All you have to do is take the word you have selected, or the word, if you don't have choices, take the word you think it means and put it in place of this word right here that we're trying to define, okay? Jamie knew about how much weight he would gain. Jamie wondered, he worried, or he celebrated, okay? And the one you should have chosen is that he wondered, okay? He didn't know because this was a first-time thing, okay? He wasn't really worried about it, and he couldn't really celebrate because he hadn't completed the 3-month process yet. So the only one that makes sense would be he wondered. So wondered and speculated. That would be how we find what speculated means, by using common sense, okay? Another way to help us with context clues is sometimes the author's going to provide us with an example of the word. And in most cases, they're going to provide us with more than one example. Just in case that first example doesn't click, then they'll give us another example and we'll say, oh yeah, okay, now I know what it means because this is an example of this. I know this example, therefore I understand the meaning of the word. Now, when using the example context clue, they're going to give us some signal words that tell us, okay, here is an example of what this word is. It's going to be, for instance, such as, it consists of, or even including, okay? An example of this would be some authors use pseudonyms. For example, famous American author Mark Twain's real name was Samuel Clemens, okay? So they gave us an example of someone who used a pseudonym, and now you just have to determine what they mean by that. What is that example showing us? The example is showing us that a pseudonym is a pen name, okay, or a different name from their real name, okay. Actors use it all the time. We don't call them pseudonyms, but actors use it. They don't use their names. Sometimes the names don't go with, if they're a pop star, their agents might have them, you know, change their name so it's a catchy name so people will remember those names. So Samuel Clemens used the pseudonym Mark Twain, okay, for his pen name. Now, back to the end of this, or the review, to wrap it up, goes back to context clues. Again, context clues is when we take an unfamiliar word and we put it, or surround it with words that we are familiar with, to help us understand the meaning of the word, okay? And if we understand how context clues help us, then we are more likely to comprehend better, because when we read a passage, whether it's a paragraph or an essay, it doesn't slow us down as much, because now we know how to use that strategy, the context clue. Again, the ones that we discussed, we said we could use the SAGE method to help us remember these context clues. Synonym, words that have the same or similar meaning. Antonyms are words that have opposite meaning. Those are the ones we learned in the last lesson. In this lesson, we learned general context, and you heard me refer to that as also common sense, because sometimes they may give us sometimes they may give us a definition, sometimes they expect us to just use logic and reasoning, and therefore it's common sense based on our prior knowledge about that particular subject. And then the last one would be examples. The author just throws in an example of what it looks like. And we had some keywords or signal words that would help us recognize when an example is being used. For instance, including, and then the most obvious, for example. And most of the time, again, the writer or the author of whatever you're reading will give you a couple of examples, so that if you don't understand the first example, then we can look at the other example and then determine what they want us to know and how to understand what that word means. And so this will wrap up our lesson on context clues.